Hey everyone, it's Dr. Antonelli back again for our topic 7, part 3 of the personal, social, and moral development lecture. Since we've already covered personal and social, we are now moving into moral development. Moral development has to do with morality and pro-social behaviors, and this first slide kind of gives general definitions of these, morality being kind of the standard for behavior that people feel preserve other people's rights and welfare. What kind of behavior do we want to exhibit? What do we feel is most important? Moral issues that relate to others as well. Okay, we have internal kind of moral compass that guides the things that we do that could impact others as well. And then we have what are called pro-social, which are known as positive behaviors. So I always tell you to remember the P in pro-social with the P in positive. And this is behavior that's directed toward promoting the well-being of another person. So again, remember the overall goal of this topic that we've been discussing is our students and how they develop both in three ways, actually: personally, socially, and morally. So here we are again talking about how can we promote this kind of pro-social or positive behavior in our classrooms. Okay, let's talk about some, again, general statements, just like we did in the other two audio lectures. The first one is as early as almost 4 years of age, let's just say, which is a pretty early age, children kind of begin applying things that they are feeling internally to their behavior. So a good example of this is when you're watching young children play and one child pushes another child to the ground, let's just say, as an example, and that child starts crying, and then the child who did the pushing kind of realizes that, oh, I think I did something wrong because they're crying now, they might be hurt. That is a good example of this internal standard of what's going on in a child as early as 4 years old. 4 years of age. Okay, over time, children can increasingly tell the difference between what we call moral transgressions versus conventional transgressions. Transgressions being a moral wrongness. And the difference between moral and conventional is as follows. A moral transgression is where it kind of violates human rights. It's a very serious kind of transgression. This would be quite simply the killing of another individual. In certain cultures, though, moral transgressions could take the form of something like if there's a certain piece of the culture that sees something as sacred, and people are not respecting that sacred piece in that particular culture, it can be considered a moral transgression. A conventional transgression, a little bit different. These are kind of less serious kind of violations, if you want to think of it that way. They violate what we call conventional behaviors. An example would be we don't burp in public, whether it's a restaurant or anywhere else. That's known as a conventional transgression. Another example could be where students are taught to address their teachers as Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so, and if they don't, let's say they know them outside of school and then they address them by their regular first name in school, many people might see that as a conventional transgression. It just gives you, a couple of examples there for conventional. Couple of other statements, things to remember about morality and pro-social behaviors is that children, as they go on through their school years, will increase their ability to respond to something bad that happens to someone else. Okay, so they often feel this a lot more as they age. Whereas really young children, if another child is upset over something, a younger child may not pick up on that as well or respond. But it's that example of when they do have this capacity, they go over and pat them on the back and say, "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay." That's a response emotionally to some other misfortune or stress or distress that another child is having. So a couple of terms to remember here: guilt and shame versus empathy and sympathy. Just for terminology sake, guilt and shame refer to something someone feels when we do something unacceptable, whereas empathy and sympathy is when we feel a certain way for others, but there's no wrongdoing on our part. So we feel empathy and sympathy, even though we were not involved in the reason why the other person is feeling as bad as they do. Okay, there was no wrongdoing on our part. So that's the difference between guilt and shame versus empathy and sympathy. Okay, over time, students can reason about moral issues in a more kind of abstract, remember Piaget's stages of abstract versus concrete thinking. That again takes time. They also become a little more flexible where they can kind of argue through the moral issues a bit, like, well, they should have done this, but they could have done this, or this can be okay in this case, but not in this case. Okay, so that's the kind of thing you will see over time. So depending on what grade level you're teaching, you'll have to kind of keep that in mind developmentally. These moral issues are often dilemmas that actually do not have a clear-cut right or wrong answer to them. And one of the greatest examples that's used in most psychology classes is the Heinz dilemma. And I have that on the next slide. So let's talk about it, because you might have seen this in one or more of your other classes when it comes to discussions of dilemmas and abstract thinking and figuring out how to address certain situations that don't have one right answer. So in Europe, a woman was near death from a rare form of cancer. There was one drug that doctors thought might save her, a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The druggist was charging $2,000, 10 times what the drug cost him to make. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together about half of what the drug cost. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. But the druggist said no. So Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. Okay, so start thinking about that, and we would, of course, have had a discussion in class. I would like to have this discussion on Zoom when we do meet this week, so just keep that in mind if you're watching this before our Zoom meeting. We will have a discussion about, do you think this was, what Heinz did was morally correct? Yes or no? Why not? We'll discuss that on our Zoom meeting. A couple of other things to remember about morality and pro-social behaviors. Remember Piaget's concept of disequilibrium, where we thought we knew something, new information was introduced, and now we're questioning because we can't really fit it into something we already know, and it's kind of making us feel a bit uncomfortable, and then we're able to reconcile it with information we already know, and then we get back to an equilibrium. So when it comes to moral development, this applies because when a moral situation arises, a dilemma arises, it becomes a challenge to us where we have to say, wait, I thought this is how we should solve this, but after giving it some thought, no, it seems like this might be a better way, and we have to kind of talk through it, okay? And by talking through these things, it's promoting more sophisticated and higher level thinking in students, okay? How students and what they're thinking and feeling at the time is going to influence how they behave morally and pro-socially, and connecting it to sense of self from the personal development part of this topic. Moral values will eventually become embedded in someone's sense of self when they decide that this is how moral decisions should be made, or what kind of moral behaviors they're going to follow and implement. Okay, Kohlberg is an extremely important person to remember when it comes to moral development, and he has 3 levels with stages underneath each of them, 3 levels and 6 stages. Let's look at each one quickly. Pre-conventional morality has to do with 2 stages. This is punishment avoidance and obedience, where a person or a child is worried about the external consequences and getting caught at this level. That's as far as it goes. Just don't want to get caught with whatever I'm doing in my choice. Stage 2 is the exchange of favors, where if I do something for you, I expect something in return. And that's how I'm going to guide, my moral compass is going to be based on if I can get something out of this as well. That's all under level 1. Under level 2, we have stages 3 and 4. It's conventional morality, which really is all about, obedience to authority. So stage 3 is this good boy, good girl kind of act, idea where it takes place usually in elementary schools, but also in middle schools and high schools. It's all about doing something that pleases others. And stage 4 of law and order usually doesn't take place before high school. And those in this stage kind of look at what society says we should look at in order to make these kinds of decisions. So it's a little more advanced, okay? Level 3 is the post-conventional morality. Circle the word post, the little piece of the term there. And where the idea is that rules are not the absolute authority. There are rules and laws out there. However, they may not be what's needed in a certain situation to, solve a dilemma or come up with a solution to a dilemma. So this level usually we do not see in students or people before college age or adulthood. And the 2 stages under there have to do with what are called a social contract, where again, if something is good for the general kind of order of people and the population, then that can become an agreement. Or the universal ethical principle in stage 6 is one of this idea of, think of civil disobedience, where a person will disobey or break a law, be willing to be arrested for it because they have just this strong inner conscience about a certain topic or action that they're taking. So that's, again, stage 6, universal ethical principle. Think about Kohlberg's stages, that these 3 stages, 6 stages and 3 levels. And when we meet on Zoom, we'll talk about how they apply to maybe Heinz's dilemma. And there are a number of kind of analyses that are done all over the internet if you just do a search for this. And it basically will kind of pick apart Heinz's dilemma and put it into Kohlberg's stages so that you get a good idea. But we could talk about that at the Zoom meeting. And then the last thing to remember is, what can teachers do to promote moral reasoning and pro-social behavior? You should always try to expose students to different models of moral and pro-social behavior, constantly kind of engaging them in discussions of these kinds of issues. Some teachers I know in their classrooms give an age or use an age-appropriate moral dilemma, and they ask students about it and ask them to think about it throughout the week, and then they come together at the end of the week to discuss what their ideas were related to that dilemma. And it's always interesting. It's an always interesting conversation depending on what grade level you're teaching. And then, of course, getting students actively involved in community service always promotes pro-social or positive behaviors. These are behaviors, again, remember, that are often done for the good of the whole of the population and society as a whole. So community service is a big one to promote that. So lots of ideas here for moral reasoning and these pro-social behaviors and things that teachers definitely need to take into consideration in their classrooms. Okay, so hopefully if you have any questions, we will discuss this a little further, or you can always email me with questions about anything in this topic 7, three parts to the PowerPoint. Okay, all right, we'll meet up again. Bye.